This week on A Lively Experiment, 7 months after the Washington Bridge was closed abruptly, we're no closer to replacing it or knowing why it happened. And the state of Rhode Island has been warehousing hundreds of children in DCYF custody for lengthy periods of time.
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by...
Hi, I'm John Hazen-White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.
Joining us on the panel, David Salvatore, former president of the Providence City Council and newly appointed executive director of the Providence Foundation. Political contributor Rob Horowitz, and Steph Machado, Boston Globe reporter and contributor for Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Welcome to Lively. I'm Jim Hummel, and it is great to be back with you again this week. Controversy continues to swirl around President Biden's bid for re-election. We'll have more on that a little later. But first, Governor McKee and his team met with reporters on Tuesday for an update on the Washington Bridge. After nearly an hour of back and forth, we still don't know when a new bridge will be built, who will rebuild it, and how much it will cost. Not to mention how we got here. Steph, you had the pleasure, I say that in quotes, of both covering the press conference on Tuesday, and then we're taping on a Wednesday. This morning, the lawyers met. So dive in where you want.
Well, I'll say that we have more unknowns than ever. The unknown from Tuesday's press conference being when will the bridge reopen? The timeline is murkier than ever. And then on Wednesday, it's who is the state going to sue? Who is responsible for the bridge's failure? The news that we got was if we sue, which we probably will, it's going to happen in August. So next month, we should presumably know who is getting sued over the bridge. It doesn't mean that we're going to get the forensic analysis that will tell us everything about what went wrong.
David?
Well, look, there are businesses in Providence who are still negatively impacted by the bridge closure. We know that businesses and residents on the East Bay are negatively impacted by this closure. But let's keep in mind that while we all want answers and accountability needs to happen, we want to get this right the first time. So I understand where the governor is coming from. If there's one thing that Rhode Islanders don't like, they don't like paying for things twice. So we don't want to have this conversation 20 or 30 years from now, the same one that we're having today. But again, we are disappointed that we don't know when this bridge is going to be rebuilt. It's good that a vendor has been secured to demolish the existing bridge. But again, I think it's important that we get this right the first time. The governor has a lot of questions to answer, and rightfully so. The business community, I know in Providence, are demanding answers, and again, rightfully so.
There was an old book by Jimmy Breslin about the Brooklyn mob called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. And this is what this reminds me of. You can't make it up. They put out a request for a proposal, and all these firms that want to make money, no one bids. I also think the other issue here is that there's a public interest. If you're going to let lawyers, and I think most of this is an excuse, Caitlin, if you're going to let lawyers define when you're going to give information to the public, you're putting something that's much less important than creating some public trust here, of which at this point there is zero. Much more important to get the forensic analysis out. So be it if the state gets $5 or $10 million less, if that's even the trade-off here. And we still have no answers. We still have no one really taking any real responsibility. And if you were trying to figure out how to handle this as badly as you could handle something, they pretty much succeeded.
I think the frustrating thing is there were basic questions like, okay, the contractors have said this is too aggressive a timetable. Is it fair to say that it's going to take longer than our original timetable? Nobody would even admit to that. Anybody around this table who doesn't even know anything about construction would say, well, that's going to back us off a little bit.
And just to put a finer point on it, the design phase was supposed to start in August 2024. So next month, this contractor was supposed to start designing the bridge. That's obviously not going to happen because nobody bid to be the design/builder. So what we were trying to get at was, is this now pushed into 2027? Because the original end date was September of 26 at the latest. So are we now saying, okay, September 26th is the earliest. We were just trying to get.
But the governor wouldn't even
right.
go down that road.
We were just trying to get a ballpark. I think everyone understands that construction timelines change, materials, cost overruns, what have you. But just trying to get a ballpark. You've told the public September of 26. Are we now going into 2027? Are we going even further than that? And they wouldn't even give any sort of a ballpark. And I think that's indicative of the fact that they really don't know what kind of bids they're going to get now that everyone has rejected the timeline they originally came up with.
Playing off your point though, Rob, if it comes down to now 38 studios, we got money back, but this is, I think people want to attach a name or an entity or somebody who's responsible. How did the bridge go from being fine on December 10th to not fine on December 11th? And if it came down to me, we have a $14 billion budget, like you said. What if we get $100 million back? Wouldn't you rather sacrifice that for the accountability? And it seems like the governor's putting the legal case in front of all of that.
I think they're putting a legal case in front of all that, and I can't read in anybody's heart and mind, but I think some of it is just an excuse for not providing real answers. And the problem they have on this is an unwillingness to accept any real responsibility. Even in the press conference the other day, where Elvidi says, it's all you can't rule out that it's all the controversy why no one wants to bid. Well, maybe you can't, maybe you can. But part of the controversy has been created by how this has been handled, and all you can do in a crisis is build trust, accept responsibility, and then, it's probably going to take longer. People will accept that. But I don't think anyone watching any of the press conferences or watching the governor attempt to minimize all this has any faith in what's going to happen going forward. And obviously, rubber will meet the road. At some point, this is going to get rebuilt. I'm not saying that's not going to ever happen. But what's being lost here is the credibility of the McKee administration, and it goes, which is much broader than the bridge at this point.
I also wonder whether now that nobody's bid, whether somebody comes in and says, 500 million, 600 million. And you aim, I did this when I painted houses in college. That's how I put myself through college. We'd get toward the end of the summer and I really wouldn't have time. Somebody would call me and say, hey, can you paint my house? I double or triple what my normal price would be. And if they bid, we'd figure out a way to do it. It was a polite way to say, I really don't have time to do it. But now what if somebody comes in and says 500, 600, 700 million and the state says, well, that's the only bid we got. Do you worry about that? I mean, you've been in public office where you've had to deal with bids. Is that a possibility?
Well, I think that's where the governor wants to have this information session to find out what are the real issues around this project. Yes, there is controversy around it, and that could have dissuaded some contractors from bidding on such a large scope like the Washington Bridge. But again, to Rob's point, let's get it right the first time. And if it's going to take a year more, then let's do that so we're not having the same conversation 20 or 30 years from now.
And part of the controversy that may have dissuaded some companies is the state did send letters to a bunch of companies saying we might sue you. Yeah. And so I'm not saying that they wouldn't bid to build the bridge because of that, but they don't, it's sort of there's just sort of these two lanes going on. One is that all the companies that have ever worked on the bridge might get sued and we don't know which ones.
But please feel free to bid.
But please feel free to build us a new one. And, we'll have to see if they're going to issue this request for information for companies to give them feedback. Hopefully we'll get to see that feedback publicly and we can see how many companies were fearful of bidding potentially.
I think that's right. And also, they dismiss that as a possibility. Clearly, it's more possible companies aren't bidding because of the legal threat. And I'm saying there shouldn't be a legal threat than because of the quote-unquote controversy. But I think, the other issue here that when you look at the whole sort of bridge problem, though, is that no straight answers. I know a little repeating stuff, but there's no straight answers since the beginning of this. And also in terms of the legal thing, the one thing the legal folks aren't going to come back and say, oh, it was DOT's fault because they did a bad job of oversight. So that's the other thing that's, that's a piece of this puzzle. Even if, DOT generally does a good job. Clearly they missed things on this bridge. Is that going to be part of the legal thing? Obviously not. You're trying to get money back.
We asked that at the press conference and they said, clearly we're not going to sue DOT.
We're not going to sue ourselves.
And I said, well, if you find in your investigation that DOT did something wrong, will you tell the public?
Exactly.
And it's sort of this, it's sort of a convoluted answer, which is that, well, eventually all of our findings will come out in discovery, so they'll end up in court documents. But the companies that are sued might blame DOT, and that might be their defense. And so I think I left that news conference still confused about when we might get a full and complete accounting of who knew what when and who is at fault.
And here's the nub of the problem. This isn't the only DOT project. So if there's some systemic problems here, and given the sheer amount of money spent and should be spent on our infrastructure, isn't it more important to find that out faster so we can fix whatever systemic problems are at DOT? This isn't a one-off. I mean, we have lots of bridges that are it's nobody's. It's not this current DOT's fault, but our bridges are some of the worst in the country. We've got our roads are some of the worst in the country still. There's some systemic issues, or we don't know that, but if there are, let's find that out faster. That'll save a lot more money than the $10 million plus whatever 15-20% of that we're giving to John Savage and Matt Wisdom, nice guys, but that seems to me so much less important than the rest of this, and the search for the scapegoat seems to me is what the preoccupation is.
I saw a little steam coming off your head when you came in here. I don't know if it was because it was hot outside or you were still trying to process what happened during the press conference. Do you have any final thoughts on this?
I will say that I think what's getting lost in all of this, and I agree that accountability has to happen, but what's getting lost in these public conversations is the negative impact on the business community, especially in downtown Providence and East Providence. We have to continue looking for resources to help these businesses. The last thing we want to see, especially in downtown Providence, is that restaurants are closing, storefronts are closing, and that's the reality of this. So again, I would hope that that's part of the public discussion moving forward.
Okay. Steph had a very powerful story last month for both Rhode Island PBS Weekly here, the video version, and then a print version in the Boston Globe about the state. There's no other way to say it. They've been warehousing hundreds of children over the years. They can't place them in psychiatric treatment, so they have basically been at Bradley Hospital. And she did what we call in television putting a face on the story. She talked to a mother, Mary McDonough, who's had to deal with her the problems that her daughter, Rachel, has had. We have a short clip, and then we're going to discuss about it. But here's a little bit from Steph's version on Rhode Island PBS Weekly.
She essentially lived there. She was there more than she was home. When she was able to come home, it was just the same thing. You know, it didn't seem like anything was working for her. We did it for as long as we can, but as she got bigger, you know, she was throwing me against the wall and she was pushing me onto the floor.
Eventually, her parents were confronted with a difficult choice: to discharge Rachel to a residential treatment center rather than continuing the cycle of repeat hospitalizations.
There was nothing in Rhode Island available. There was no girls' residentials. And so they started, you know, towards the end, looking like all over the United States. That was just one of those things that I had a hard time with, because how can you mother your child in California?
Mary says it took a year for the Department of Children, Youth and Families, or DCYF, to find a spot for Rachel at a residential facility in Massachusetts. For most of that time, she languished at Bradley.
As it turns out, that Bradley Hospital is just like a nursing home for children waiting for residential placement.
It is an appalling failure.
Rhode Island's U.S. Attorney Zachary Cunha says the Department of Justice started investigating the situation at Bradley in 2022.
We looked at a time period between 2017 and 2022, and in that time we found there were 527 kids who were housed longer than they should have been at Bradley. The idea that you're basically, instead of living the normal life of a kid, you're in a locked room in a psychiatric hospital, the potential consequences of that are terrible.
If you want to see Steph's full version, you can go to ripbs.org/weekly. Steph, this is, as appalling as this is something that a lot of people have known about for a long time, and it's taken the head of the U.S. Justice Department in Rhode Island to bring it to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, when I was working on this story, I talked to so many advocates and just people who work in child welfare who say we've been screaming about this for years. And the president of Bradley Hospital told me that he's been bringing it up to DCYF for, a decade. And so the fact that there's this federal scrutiny on it, more attention is being put on it, hopefully will lead to some change.
Yeah, and the report was really moving, and I know the state had a similar issue several years ago where we had Judge McConnell you had to have kind of a federal order around what essentially were sweatshops where they're putting people with developmental disabilities in as opposed to giving them real job training and how they should be treated. Similar issue, and very unfortunate, especially since our state generally we have some weaknesses, but usually we do pretty well on these kinds of issues broadly on healthcare and things like this. The one thing I was wondering about in the report stuff is what are they're talking about community supports, clearly better if people can stay in their own homes, stay in their own neighborhoods. What are some of the things the state should be doing? I know you mentioned in the report you could pay foster parents, but if you had a kid or a teenager with these kinds of difficulties, what kinds of programs? Does there need to be more day programs? Does there need to be more home visitation? What are some things we could do as a state if we really put the priorities where they should be?
Yeah, so there's sort of two things. First of all, they need somewhere to live, and so that's the part about the foster homes. If they don't have, in this case, the girl in my story, Rachel, her parents still have custody of her, so she can go home to her parents' house. But what they would need is supports in the home, whether that is a social worker, a psychiatrist, professionals who are trained to work with teenagers with psychiatric problems who can come to the home and help them, essentially. And then there's also outpatient therapy and different services that you can get. So it's sort of a combination depending on the child's needs, whether they need someone coming into the home, whether the parents can just bring them to appointments, whether they need a day program, as you mentioned. There's not enough of those. It really depends on the kid, but there's just not enough of all of those services, in-home, outpatient, residential, and day programs. And that's how kids end up staying at the hospital, which is the worst environment.
Because there's nowhere to put them.
Because they just don't have options for discharge.
Look, every child deserves dignity and compassion, and we should be advocating for them. But I saw this firsthand as a member of the city council. I had constituents who ran into very similar issues, and now I'm witnessing it firsthand as a parent of a Providence public school student, and how often children are removed from a school, and we don't know where they're going. And so, look, Bradley Hospital has done great work for many, many years. I don't think we should be pinning the blame on them. Their president obviously spoke out and said something. He sounded the alarm. But I do think the state needs to do their part in providing those resources that are necessary. I did see in your piece that a new building or a new facility is being considered, or it is going to be built. It just sounds, and again, just from experience from being on the council, there just aren't enough wraparound services.
Well, the St. Mary's fiasco has kind of thrown a wrench into it also, because that was a place where they could go, and that's no longer an option.
The Bradley Hospital president told me that was the primary place they were discharging kids to after Bradley. And that's not to say that a residential treatment center is the ideal place for kids to be long term, but it's at least a step down from a hospital in terms of the level of restriction. But yes, there is a new girls' facility that's supposed to be built in Exeter. But advocates say that we shouldn't really be focusing on building more residential facilities. We should be focusing on getting these services in the community where a kid can live at home and get services. And they say it's also cheaper to do it in the community.
Okay. The last time we were with you on Lively, we were off for the 4th of July week. President Biden and former President Trump had just finished their debate. There's been an awful lot happening since then. Rob, let me begin with you. You've written 2 very forceful columns for Go Local Prov, basically saying the president should get out. And your feeling hasn't changed. He's done a lot of damage control this week. He's tried to rally the troops. You feel even more so.
Yeah, I felt pretty strongly about it. And just in fairness to the president, I felt that way in September, October of last year, too. I think that's when the party and the president probably should have had this conversation, but hindsight's 2020. I do think Donald Trump is and Jim, this will not surprise you that I think this, is an existential threat to the country. I think he's a threat to democracy. The problem for President Biden is right now he doesn't pass the eye test. This isn't about all the media spin. This isn't about the editorials. This is about when voters look at him, the combination of his significantly diminished ability to communicate, which is the worst example was that debate, but it's not the only example, and his stilted and frail appearance, people aren't confident. 3/4 of voters, even before the debate, thought he was be too old to serve effectively in another term. So the problem is in a race like that, could he still win? Trump's very unpopular. He's got a 55% of voters are unfavorable. Could he win? Sure. Is he likely to win? No. And is it fair to the country? Can anyone sort of picture him governing 4 years from now? It's kind of hard to see. There's still time to change candidates and have an open convention.
I think he, excuse me, I think he still has time to make a decision. But what nobody is talking about is his track record over the last 3.5 years.
Well, he's talking about it a lot.
He's talking about it, but I think the party has to start talking about that accomplishment or those
But every day,
more.
David, that they talk about his limitations is one less day to either focus on Trump or to focus on, and as they say, look, it's a trite statement, elections are about the future.
Well,
so I think a lot of people say he's done a great job, but do I see him as being able to do this job 6 or 12 months from now?
I'd say two quick things about it. One is he has done a very good job, but the voters don't agree with that. He has a 40% approval rating. Approval rating is what correlates, is the one measure that correlates most with re-election percentage. So I think he's done a great job. David thinks he's done a great job. But most voters don't think he's done a great job, and part of it is you would have expected his approval rating to go up because when people look at him, I think that's the break on his approval rating. The other thing is, as you said, elections about the future. The British famously thanked Winston Churchill for his great job of leadership in World War II by electing somebody else.
Wait, so I want to nail down, David. Do you think he should stay in the race?
That's a decision for him to make.
But what do you think? You're a Democrat.
Well, I mean, again, he has a decision to make. And should he stay in the race based on his record? Yes.
Okay, interesting. What I'm curious about as an observer, because obviously as a reporter I don't have a stance one way or another, is can the Democratic Party get behind a new nominee that they did not select? Because the primaries are over. There is no chance to go back to the voters and have them select between Kamala Harris or Gavin Newsom or who else? There's been other names thrown out there as potential candidates. The Democratic Party won't get, the voters won't get to decide.
Well, the rules say they can, but there's a lot to get from here to there.
Of course, the rules say they can. I'm just saying, will the public get behind a nominee they didn't pick?
Yes, here's sort of my gut. There's no easy answers here, and it's a legitimate question. One is nobody ran against Joe Biden, in part because he was the incumbent president, and they did a pretty good job of sort of forcing any opposition out of the race. It wasn't a real primary. So yeah, he did win, but he ran against nobody. He ran against Dean Phillips and Bobby Kennedy.
Just like they forced Bernie out in 2016.
Well, Bernie also lost.
I understand that.
I mean, Hillary. That was a real.
You're right, but
that was a real contest between those two. I think because Donald Trump is viewed by Democrats as such an existential threat, I think the party will unify around. It'll be messy. It's a Democratic Party. What did Will Rogers say? I belong to no organized party. I'm a Democrat. It's still true, but you'll have a process at the convention. You could have a debate beforehand. You can have the convention delegates vote. Anybody. Kamala Harris would probably have a little bit of a edge on everybody else, but we've got some very good governors. Whoever comes out of that convention. I'm very confident Democrats will unify behind and will have a much better chance. Anyone under 60, any Democratic under 60 with a pulse can probably beat Donald Trump.
But I also wonder, though, if history repeats itself, because what was Hillary Clinton? If it had been any other candidate but Clinton, probably in 2016, probably would have beat Trump if she didn't have the baggage, is my opinion. And I wonder if the same thing now, if you had a stronger person than Joe Biden, his record notwithstanding, does Trump get in twice if that happens because the Democrats failed to put up somebody who was acceptable?
It's possible, but then there's also the fundraising piece as well. So if the Democrats are thinking about going with someone outside of the Biden-Harris ticket, that individual is going to have a very difficult time raising the money necessary for a victory in November.
I respectfully disagree. There's so much money out there. Right now, big contributors, George Clooney today, called Rob Reiner today, both big, aside from being actors and directors, big contributors. Just called on him to get out. The contributor class is voting with not spending any money now. The money that Biden has can go into a super PAC. It's unfortunate we have no real campaign finance laws that can all get spent on behalf of Biden. There's a ton of money out there. For a new candidate, there would be so much enthusiasm. You would raise way more money than Joe Biden can possibly raise right now. And the bottom line is he is on track to lose this race. He was behind, doesn't mean he can't win. He was behind Donald Trump, who 55% of the country doesn't like before the debate. It's moved a little more to Trump. And as long as he can't pass the eye test, which he won't be able to, he's got a big uphill fight.
All right, I'm sure we're going to be talking about this for weeks to come. Let's do outrages and/or kudos. Steph, let's begin with you.
So I was not a fan of the format of the debate, and this is not. I'm a fan of the two people who moderated the debate, but they chose a format where they did not push back when the candidates lied or just
deflected.
Answered a question they weren't asked, right? Went so off topic from the question they were being asked. And, I know that there's some people don't like when the moderators jump in too often, but you have to jump in a little, in my opinion, and just say, well, that wasn't true, Mr. President, or ask them to actually answer the question. And I think it made for a debate that was difficult to watch.
They should look at Tim and Ted on Channel 12.
100% agree.
Your former colleague. David, welcome back. We introduced you as the former city council president, but you also have a new job, too. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You are now heading the Providence Foundation.
Yes.
So just tell us briefly what that is, and then you can get into your outrage or kudo.
So the Providence Foundation is made up of, 150 members. We have businesses, individuals, and nonprofits as members, and we advocate for the downtown. We want to ensure that people have a place to live downtown, businesses are thriving downtown, and that we're creating institutions and supporting institutions that support a lot of the economic activity in downtown Providence. Whatever happens in downtown Providence, the ripple effect can be profound on the rest of the state and obviously the 24 other neighborhoods throughout the city of Providence. So I'm really proud to be heading up the Providence Foundation and a lot of the work that lies ahead.
Do you have an outrage or a kudo?
I don't know if it's necessarily an outrage, but your colleague, Dan McGowan, wrote a commentary piece today regarding water fire. They are financially struggling. I know Barnaby Evans, who is a fantastic artist in the city, has contributed his lifelong work to water fire and contributing to the downtown. But again, they are struggling financially. And just based on that commentary piece today and the financial struggles, if they move out of the downtown Providence or cease to exist, that could be problematic for our businesses, for tourism, and for people who want to visit.
Okay. Rob, you got the last minute.
My outrage, as it's somehow always get down to this, is Donald Trump's treatment of January 6th as recently as yesterday. Even for somebody who creates his own reality and doesn't live in reality and tells a lie a minute, his January 6th framing is outrageous. He's calling the people that beat up cops, defecated on the Capitol, and essentially blocked the actions of Congress, patriots and warriors, and they're the January 6 hostages that he wants to free when he becomes president. Obviously, why is he doing that? Because he refuses to accept that responsibility for what he did, which is incite an insurrection, and then watch it on TV and kind of cheer for it in the 2 or 3 hours after.
Okay, that is all the time we have. David, good to see you again, and Steph and Rob. Folks, if you don't catch us Friday at 7 or Sunday at noon, we archive all of our shows at ripbs.org/lively. It's the dog days of summer, but we got a lot going on. So come back next week. We'll have a full analysis of all the week's goings on. Come back as a lively experiment continues. Have a great weekend.
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by.
Hi, I'm John Hazen-White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.